This week, Zeb Wells' Amazing Spider-Man run came to an end at issue number 60, plus size, more expensive than it needed to be, celebrating something that was absolutely terrible at the end. And I think the question has to be asked, is this the worst Spider-Man run of all time? And we do have noted webhead Doc to talk about this. How you doing, Doc?
This is a question that's a little near and dear to my heart. I think it's something that needs delved into.
Absolutely. We were going to review Amazing Spider-Man 60, but it was so bad, I didn't even want to put you through it, but you even subject yourself to the comic book anyway, so serves you right reading that tripe. But I do think the thing that really screws Zeb Wells' Spider-Man run right from the beginning is the original sin, hyping up what did Peter do, this big mystery, opening up in the very first issue, not really touching it again for another year. And the longer you postpone the payoff, the bigger the payoff has to be and the more exciting that it has to be. And the payoff absolutely sucked.
You want to tease it out. You want to drag it. You know, that's kind of part of the fun of a mystery in a comic book. However, you have to at least give tiny little hints, reminders. Hey, this mystery's still going on. Zeb Wells failed that very basic kind of storytelling because he would just straight up ignore the question, not even remind us that it was still a very relevant plot point for months and months and months at a time.
Yeah, there was a lot of fallout for that mystery. You know, Aunt May hated Peter Parker. That never happens. MJ had given up on Peter Parker, told him she never wanted to be with him again. The Fantastic Four hated Peter Parker. What did he do? It must have been something big. And then when you do get the payoff over a year later, it's like MJ was in trouble. He went to the Fantastic Four building, borrowed some of their technology, and went and saved her. It's like, why is everybody mad at him? It sounds like a superheroic thing to do.
Exactly. It was like superhero 101 type stuff, and everybody's all super pissed off at him. It left most of us just kind of scratching our heads because the payoff was so poor. Every single person that was reading it goes, well, his behavior was perfectly reasonable. Like, there's no storytelling reason why it should have happened.
And that's an enormous problem because that was the big mystery. And along with the big mystery, it turns out MJ was stuck in an alternate universe where time moved faster. And if he didn't get there real quick, you know, she might like die of old age. So he had to get over there. And when he goes and saves her, there's this stupid Rabin character and all these hieroglyphs and everything. And along with saving Mary Jane comes Paul and these two kids that eventually they kind of wipe out of existence. But Paul has been there, remained there the entire time, ends up being one of the most instantly hated characters, not in the history of Spider-Man, but the history of fucking media.
Paul had the most instant go away heat of any character I had ever seen in my 30-some years reading comic books. It was the most visceral hatred from literally everyone. We live in an age where comic readers can rarely agree even on the font for the fucking masthead of a comic. We all agreed that Paul fucking sucked and needed to go away.
And it's kind of weird because we got all these different artist interpretations of Paul, and sometimes he looks like James Tynion, sometimes he looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. There's like 7 different versions of Paul where he's this stay-at-home nerd like cat dad, but he's also this enormous like superhero in his own right at one time, and you never even got the character. I don't even know who Paul is supposed to be at this point.
The first issue with John Romita Jr. art, he looked like fucking Sean King. Sometimes he's scrawny, sometimes he's jacked, sometimes he's tall, sometimes he's short. Sometimes he looks like a white guy pretending to be a black guy, sometimes he's a white guy. I have never seen a less consistent on-model drawing of a character in my entire existence. They kept changing what his actual backstory was. I guess he was the assistant to that scientist guy that created that pocket dimension. And then they found out that it was his dad and he actually did it. And he's actually kind of a super villain. But then Peter was like, yeah, it's fine. You can just stick hanging out with my ex-wife. Absolutely. I'm not going to say anything because she might get mad at me if I tell her.
Well, he's making him fucking lasagna.
It's the most baffling story arc and character arc that didn't actually do anything at any point or explain anything at any point.
Yeah, it's the wildest thing. And they know pretty early on. Zeb Wells, obviously the writer, Nick Lowe, the group editor, know pretty early on people are not responding well to this Amazing Spider-Man run. And really the thing that ends up dooming it completely in the end is there's no course correction. They don't go, you know what? This Paul character is not really working. Maybe it's time to kill him off or reveal him as being a villain. Maybe we need to do this with Peter. But they never course corrected. They went down the exact same path that they started on. I don't know if they had a long-term goal, but it ended up turning so many people off, and they never gave them a reason to come back. They just kept giving them more reasons to walk away.
They gave us a reason to stay away after they gave us a reason to leave in the first place. I mean, I've seen some really, really retarded editorial decisions with absolute refusal to course correct. I mean, you can look at the entire Krakoa era as a perfect example of that, but this was utterly baffling. At least the Krakoan era had some people that were kind of apologists for it. This had no apologists whatsoever. The only explanation is for why there was never a course correction is because they didn't have a clue what the course was in the first place.
Yeah, and then you end up having, Zeb Well saying, I'm about to do something in ASM that'll make me the most hated writer ever, as if he wasn't already. It ends up being killing off Kamala Khan in ASM. I didn't care. I guess it upset some other people. Nick Lowe going into the letters pages and just being a snarky douchebag about it. And the way that they went about it just made it worse and worse and worse.
The whole thing was just responding with more vitriol towards the readers. They tried being nice. Then they tried being forceful. Then they tried talking with their wallet. And then they just told him to go fuck himself. And at no point was there even the slightest amount of self-reflection or reflection from the company or the editorial to say, this is not working. Let's do something different.
Yeah, they were having to go out there and generate headlines, not because the book was good, but by like kind of just creating controversy out of thin air. Another big problem with this run, and this is basically a problem with every Spider-Man run, admittedly, it ends up tying into way too many events as you go along. You're getting, the gang war event, which ended up being really bad. Spider-Man is a background character. He's not even really a major figure there. You end up getting like an X-Men Spider-Man crossover dark web thing when X-Men was as cold could get as a franchise, which certainly did Spider-Man no favors. Right now it's tying into Venom War because that's a Spider-Man character. He was tying into Blood Hunt and all this stuff. So you have a writer that's struggling to find his voice and what he wants to do with Spider-Man. It just became too much. It's just too boring, and it never really helped Spider-Man or even the event because Spider-Man was becoming less and less popular along the way.
It's hard to fathom a day where the expectation going, as a Spider-Man reader, going into a book each month is, I wonder if Spider-Man's actually going to matter in this issue. That is a question that no one would ever think they would have had to ask. We've gotten to the point where that's such an expectation that he is an absolute passenger in his own title. They don't even bother to address it at this point. Everybody thinks it's perfectly normal. That should never be something that happens with a book as absolutely important to Marvel Comics as Amazing Spider-Man.
People are so apathetic that he can't even help out an event anymore. So now you have events that were kind of struggling like Blood Hunt that are struggling even worse because Spider-Man's not propping up anymore. Who's talking about Venom War right now? Spider-Man's been a major figure in there. One of the first things that happens in Venom War is Peter Parker getting back together with the black, Venom symbiote suit. Nobody talked about it. Nobody cared because eventually everybody just tuned out because the writing was so bad. And you don't even see Peter Parker win anymore. He just kind of loses all the time.
Oh, exactly. He loses every single outing. I get that they're still on this mandate from Joe Quesada because he got a divorce 20 years ago that Peter can't be happy, but he stopped being even an aspirational character and is now just a straight up loser in his own fucking book. And nobody at Marvel seems to even want to acknowledge this. They're getting told on a monthly basis, stop making Spider-Man a fucking loser. And what do? They just make him a bigger loser next month. I know that there's a lot of us that have thought it over the years. They're intentionally sabotaging Peter to try to make some of their other Spider characters that are more, topical and the modern versions to make them actually get over. It hasn't been successful yet, and it seems like they're still doing it 10 years later at this point.
The final thing I'll talk about, and I hate to bring this up, they brought John Romita Jr. back. He had a very bad tenure there at DC Comics. John Romita Jr. isn't the artist that he once was. And I do think if this was a well-written, well-constructed Spider-Man run, and you had John Romita Jr.'s art in there, people might be able to enjoy it as a nostalgia play in there. But because the story was so bad and because the writing was so bad, you're almost asking John Romita Jr. at this point in his career to carry the book, which he's incapable of. And it ends up kind of spotlighting that he isn't the artist that he used to be.
I was one of those guys that way back in the day was always kind of a little tiny bit disappointed when John Romita Jr. would end up on a title that I was reading. But I appreciated him and I understood his appeal, but I developed an appreciation for him over the years. Look, unfortunately, he just kind of doesn't have it anymore. As a guy that was doing 2 issues a month for the majority of the past 40 years, eventually you kind of, I guess, wear out your talent. You whittle it down to the point where you're just burned out. And I think John Romita has reached a burnout stage. Unfortunately, it's unfair to ask him at this point to carry the workload and the sales success or failure, because that's really what they were doing. And he is not really up to the task anymore, unfortunately.
So I guess the big question here at the end, we've kind of talked about the things that did not work out for this Amazing Spider-Man run. And if we wanted to talk about all of it, it would take us a few hours because that's how bad it was. That's how porous it was. We had the Dan Slott run, very, very long run. I would say the second half especially, very, very disappointing, amongst the worst of all time. You talk about things like One More Day. I don't think JMS has the worst Spider-Man run of all time, but he certainly has the most notorious. What do you think about runs of Amazing Spider-Man? Obviously, this is very fresh, but where do you think Zeb Wells is going to end up sitting?
JMS started really high and kind of ended really low. Even if I take out One More Day, we still have to address the fact that Sins Past was there. Howard Mackie and John Byrne's run is up there, and Zeb Wells is up there as well. Slott is hard to really appreciate or not appreciate, especially since he started and for the first 2 years of his run was maybe 3 years of his run. He was part of the Spider-Man Brain Trust during the 3 times a month era. He wasn't writing all those books. I know they gave him credit for being on the book for X number of teen years, except for the first 4 or 5 of those, he was one of 7 writers. The Just Slott run had some okay highs, some really, really lows. There's a lot of things in Slott's run that are a lot more forgivable than I think.
That's the thing that Wells is missing. He doesn't have those okay highs.
Yes, he doesn't have
He's
the
got
okay
the Tombstone story.
He had the Tombstone story in the beginning of the series when we were all bitching about what the fuck did Peter do? We weren't even able to appreciate it because they had sidelined the mystery from the first issue by the beginning of the second. He doesn't have those highs because even the little bit of a high is tainted. I'd say that he's worse than Slott. I'd say he's worse than JMS because, hey, look, at least during the JMS run, I got a bunch of J. Scott Campbell covers. So no, I'm going to have to say it is probably in the top 2. It's tied with Mackie and Byrne is probably my most hated run.
Now we are moving on to Joe Kelly, Justina Ireland, Ed McGuinness, Gleb Melnikov, 8 Deaths of Spider-Man tying into the One World Under Doom. Basically just a placeholder until the real new Amazing Spider-Man writer comes in. I know you're a Joe Kelly fan. I've read his Wolverine, Deadpool, World War III, WW3 thing. I read his spine-tingling or nonstop Spider-Man, whatever that thing was. Haven't been very impressed with Joe Kelly as of late. I know you're a big fan. Are you going to be there for this one?
I'm going to have to say no. And the reason why is because, okay, I'm getting Joe Kelly Spider-Man, but I'm also going to be forced to be saddled with Justina Ireland. And I know absolutely for certain that if this is a successful run, they're going to end up using it as the justification to make Justina Ireland the new permanent writer on ASM. They just need an excuse to say, hey, her and Joe Kelly pulled the sales way back up, and give her all the credit, even though she's fucking nobody. That's the exact game plan and marketing strategy that they're going to go with. And I don't want to contribute to that, I guess you could say.
So there you go. Really want to say thank you very much to Doc for joining me today. If you like this entire conversation, fully unedited and uncensored, because I did have to scale it down here for YouTube, you do need to visit us on Think Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. The Doc is right here. This is going to be part of the Doc Unfiltered podcast, and you get more Doc than you could ever handle every single week on the Patreon.